In this video we're going to see how to edit motion capture for locomotion sets. So typically I have an actor here running forward, running a few steps and then stopping. And then he does it backwards, and a little later on in the mocap he does it on the left and to the right. So we have like a strafing set. In this case we're only going to focus on the forward for this example. And our goal is to cut this mocap into a start, a loop, so a cycle, and a stop, which is what you need to do typically for games. So I already have my mocap baked onto the control rig, and I'm ready to edit it already. I'm working on this jog mocap take right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is come to the story mode, insert current take, and I'm going to cut certain parts of that mocap. So, he moves forward and then he starts going backwards, so I can already cut that second part and delete it, activate my story and start working on it. So usually I come to like a side view maybe, and I look at I look for the idle pose, and when the character starts leaning forwards, I'm gonna cut when he's still pretty much in idle, so maybe here. In this case, you see that he starts moving his front foot first. So during starts, you have two types. You have moving your front foot first, or you have moving your back foot first. So you just want to choose what looks best for your character. And then there's like a few passing poses. So passing poses, the knees cross each other. And you can see that there's a strong lean here. So I want to keep that during my start, and then maybe he's going to do a few steps, and then usually he comes upright again as he's in the full cycle. So I'm going to cut somewhere here after a couple steps. So 1, 2, and then I have my cycle starting. So you have a few steps. So depending on the mocap stage that this was recorded in, you might have a lot of steps or just a few if the stage was smaller. So maybe for the cycle you want to cheat and actually you can choose some of the steps that are already in the start if you don't have enough. So here it comes upright, and I could have my cycle mocap starting from there as well. So I can expand it a bit across the start, which is in green here. That's not a problem. Then he has a couple steps, and before the stop, usually the character starts leaning back. So we don't want that part in the cycle, because that would make it inconsistent. So I'm gonna cut a bit before. And now I'm going to focus on the purple part, which is my stop. So for the stop, there's usually a last passing pose before the stops really kicks in. So in this case, he does a big step forward, and he locks his front foot, and then he settles into idle. So I'm going to cut the stop maybe at that last passing pose before. So depending on how your game engine works, maybe you actually need a lot of steps before to blend, but in our case we want to do a very responsive stop that's very short, both in terms of timing and in terms of distance. We want the character to stop on a very short distance. Then the character comes into idle and settles. There's a little bit of secondary motion on the arms, and I want to cut before it starts doing the other action, going backwards. So I'm going to cut somewhere here. I always look for passing poses because they are easier to find, and it's also what I use once in the engine, once in Unreal, to add sync markers, sync notifies to synchronize the start and the loop, for example. Okay, so I have my start, my loop, and my stop. I'm going to rename those. So double click on the clip. You have the asset settings opening up, and I'm going to call that jog forward start. I'm going to copy this, jog forward. So usually for the cycle, I don't say loop. I just say like jog forward and jog stop. Now that I have my 3 clips, I'm going to select them and use Mobile Core to plot them to different takes. So I have my 3 takes at the bottom. The script unfortunately added space 1, so I'm going to delete that. Move them to my editing category, and just to keep a backup of the mocap, like really the raw mocap, I'm going to duplicate those already. So I have start 001, etc. at the bottom, so I know that's my original mocap, and here I have the takes that I'm going to edit. And if your long mocap take, really the original one, here it's like more than 1000 frames. If you know you selected all the mocap you needed from there, you can always delete it because I know I have my raw mocap here. It's always good to keep the raw mocap to A/B, compare your edit with the original mocap. So I have my start, my loop, and my stop here. I have my start, I have my future loop, and I have my stop. So when you have these, first thing you want to do is align them nicely to the scene. Because when I look at the start, the character like goes in a slight diagonal. On the cycle, it's even worse, like he's on the side. And it's very important to work on one straight axis. Otherwise, it's impossible to make the animation loop properly, and it's a nightmare. So you really want to align it first. I prefer to do that manually than using a script. So I'm going to add my start to story mode. I'm going to come to the side. And with the ghost mode active, I can move it. First, I'm going to move it back to make sure that the character like starts like not too much in front or too back, like really centered. And same from the front view. And then you want to work in front view to ignore the forward motion. So when you're in front view, you come to the first frame, you align it to the middle, and then you come to the last frame, and you can see that here is like he's moved to the side, so you want to rotate that take so that he's aligned and you know, work on a straight line. I can then bake that and move on to the cycle. So same thing on the cycle, I'm gonna maybe move him back. So sometimes you're on the first frame and the gizmo is a little bit far. You just want to like deactivate story and reactivate, and that resets the gizmo at the first frame of the clip. So I'm going to move it back, then come to front view and center it, and then on the last frame I'm going to make sure it's also like centered. So sometimes it's pretty much there, so you don't have to do anything, and sometimes you just want to like slightly offset it and rotate it. Here I can see that there is a slight, like he moves a little bit to the side and then he comes back to the center. So like his trajectory, if I come to the top view with Control T, I can see that his trajectory is like an S, right? If I select the hips. So there are several solutions for that. Like you can work with it and ignore it for now and clean it up later. Or if you have enough steps in your mocap, you can also reduce the length of your clip and maybe ignore certain steps where he moves a bit to the side and select a moment where he's really going onto a straight line. So if I select the pelvis, I can see that maybe this last part is pretty straight, or this first part up until here is pretty straight, so I could cut that, just keep that first part here and choose to align it. So now I have like something that's pretty straight. But in my case, I don't have enough steps, so I don't want to do that. What I want to do is, so here I have my cycle like pretty much straight. There's just this moment here where he goes to the side, somewhere in the middle. So I'm already going to bake that. And then outside of story mode, on a layer, I'm already gonna like take that part here and move him to the center. I hold Q to ignore all the pinning, and I key in full body. And then here, as he comes to the side again, I'm gonna zero that out, so it's centered again. And then maybe at the very end, center him as well. So for now, I'm not making it loop. I'm just making sure that he kind of stays on a straight line, like roughly. It's still rough. There's still a little bit of movement, like to the side, like the hips still go to the side, left and right, which is a good thing. But I remove like the main drifting. You know, like I don't want him to move like more than, you know, the width of his hips. Like I don't want him to move like that much. This is too much. I just want like maximum maybe 20% of drifting. So that's what I've done here. And of course, because I just have a few keys, the feet slides a bit, right? During that interpolation, I introduced a little bit of like lateral sliding on the feet. So to ignore that, I'm just going to apply the adjustment blend script. And at every step of the way, I want to make sure I don't introduce overextension on the legs. So maybe I want to use some IK pulling here before baking. And IK pulling is going to make sure that the angle of the calves are maintained from the original layer, and so they are pulling down the hips to maintain that angle and not overextend. Then I'm going to come to my stop and align the stop to the front view as well. So insert current take. I'm going to move it all the way at the back so it's centered with the origin of the scene. Same in front view. Then come to the last frame and maybe rotate that. So our three animations are aligned to the weld, roughly. So if you want, because we just did like a basic alignment, you can also like delete your mocap now and reduplicate your takes. The next thing I want to do is actually make the cycle, so the loop, actually loop. So if I look at the cycle from the front view and I activate the loop here on the timeline, I can see that it doesn't loop perfectly, of course. So here, to make it perfectly loop, I don't want to apply a pose at the beginning and at the end, because if I do that, maybe the first and last pose are going to match, but not necessarily the tangents, not the curves at the beginning and end. The easiest to make an animation loop is to add it to the story mode and cut it in the middle, or cut it somewhere where you really like the animation. So in my case, I can still see a bit of lean at the beginning, and then during that part here, that middle part, I really like, because he has like a regular motion, like he doesn't lean or accelerate or decelerate. So I'm going to cut the animation somewhere here in the center. And the trick is to take the second half and put it before the first half. So remember that here at, in my case, frame 39, I cut the animation. So I have a continuity of movement because I just cut the motion in the middle. So I know that those tangents are going to work. They're going to match. So if I move the second half before the first half, I can already see at the end that it loops perfectly, right? So now we just have to blend the middle part to make it loop, because here I have a hiccup, but I can easily work that out. So so in the second half, I'm gonna look for a precise moment to blend. So maybe, here, for example, he plants his left foot down. So I'm gonna cut that, and I'm gonna look in the first half at something that matches. Oh, sometimes you have this bug where the character starts disappearing. It's because of the clipping of the camera. For that, you can just select your camera in your navigator. I'm going to select all my orthographic cameras, and I'm going to come to Properties, Camera Settings, and say Reset Camera. Anyway, so I'm looking for a moment when the character plants his left foot. So maybe here. And then I'm going to drag my second half next to this, and maybe re-expand a bit. So now when I look in ghost mode, so if you have the control rig, it might be a little bit hard to see what's going on. So I'm going to disable my rig here, at least the visibility. And I'm going to select one of my clips, and in Properties I'm going to make it a very vibrant color so we see more easily what's going on. Now if I disable and re-enable story, I see a bit better my two different clips. And now I can go frame by frame and check that my two clips feel in sync. Maybe my red clip is a bit in advance here, like it contacts one frame sooner. So I'm going to readjust. Yeah, this feels right, and I check the feet, but I also check the hips, because it's also very important to maintain like the hips up and down motion. So I want to make sure there's not like one of the hips that reach up too soon. I don't want any delay. Now I can select both clips and say frame start and end, so that my timeline is the length of my two clips and I don't have any dead frames at the end. And now when I play, you'll see that the animation perfectly loops seamlessly. I mean, there's a bit of jitter in the middle that we want to clean up, but that's okay. Like, at least it has a nice continuity of motion, something that you would never get by just applying the same pose at the beginning and at the end. One thing I want you to pay attention to is here it's a linear blend, so you really want to select both clips, come to Properties, Fade in, Fade out, and say Smooth. One thing to note when you do this trick of cutting in the middle and then putting the first half after the second half, and then blending that second half into the first half to clean up the loop and stitch them together, you want to look at the number of steps in your cycle, because maybe in your game engine you can only afford like 2 steps, just a basic cycle of like left foot and then right foot, and that's it. Or you could have multiple steps in one cycle and have like left, right, left, right, left, right. So multiple cycles into your whole loop, right? Because when you have mocap, you have more steps, so you can have more variety. So I'm going to look again at that same like left foot contact. And if I look like more at the end of my second half, and I come here and I select the very end, I match that, make sure it matches. Here I have a very short cycle, right? Because there's only like right on left, and it's already over, right? So I have only one cycle in my loop, right? I only have left and right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. So it feels, I mean, if the loop is perfect, it doesn't feel bad, it just feels maybe a bit repetitive. And with mocap, you can usually afford a bit more cycles inside the same loop. So instead of having just right and left, you could have that several times in your cycle. So instead of selecting a contact point at the very end of my second half, you know, a branching point, I don't know how to call it, I can select one a bit sooner. So here in my second half, I have a left foot contact here around this frame, and I have another one. I have the one at the very end. So I'm going to select the first one instead. Up. So I just crop to remember that it's on that frame that I have my left foot contact. Then I come into my first half. I look at left foot, similar contact. I'm selecting left foot, but you can select whatever feels right for you for your take. Then I know I can re-expand a little because I cropped before. I'm gonna make sure the timing is right. So frame by frame. Okay, my yellow. You can see here yellow is a bit in advance compared to blue. So I'm going to delay yellow by 1 frame. Readjust start and end. Okay, the loop is perfect. And now, instead of having just right and left, I have right, left, and right, left again. So I have 2 cycles inside my loop. Right, left, right, left. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. While before I had just 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And you could have like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3 cycles, or you could have even 4 cycles. Usually I found that 2 or 3 cycles are good enough because you don't want it to be too different either. Like it should feel a little repetitive because people do walk in repetitive cycles in a way. Maybe cycles that are going to be seen more, you want to have a little bit more steps, and cycles that are seen less, you can do a bit less steps. So maybe for an NPC, you're going to do less steps, or maybe for the walk cycles, you're going to do less steps because usually players in game, they don't walk, they run all the time. Or maybe you want more steps in the forward and a little bit less steps in the left, right, and backward because players tend to strafe a little bit less and usually they move forward. So you know, you can select where you want to put more details and more quality, because of course more steps mean that down the line you need to clean up those steps when you finalize and polish your animation, so it's a little bit more work obviously. But you want to be mindful of that where you cut your mocap and where you find your branching point is going to influence the number of steps that you have in your full loop. So you want to pay attention to that. So we made the animation loop perfectly on the forward axis, but now if we come to the side view, you'll see something odd happening. Is the character starts a bit far in the scene and then blends back and forth and then moves forward. So that's because at the beginning we selected the second half and put it before the first half. So in terms of spacing, it's not correct. So I want to move the character back at the origin on the first half, and I'm going to go somewhere like in the middle of the blend between the 2 clips, and I'm going to take my second half, so here in red, and I'm going to move it so that it matches the first half. Usually I just look at the hips, because for me it's more important to match the hips than the feet, but that depends. I really tend to like align it roughly and then maybe zoom back a little and check that the motion feels continuous and there's no like a strong slowdown or acceleration. So what you want to avoid is this, for example, up, you feel like there's a slowdown, or conversely a strong acceleration like that. Oh, there's a speed up. I don't know if that's obvious. Like this kind of effect you want to avoid. So again, I'm going to come and match it. Yeah, that feels continuous. So now we match everything like on the forward axis. And you can use the same technique if it's a left or right or backward cycle. That doesn't matter. Like, actually, when I work on a full like strafe set with forward, backward, left, and right, I align all my animations to the forward axis. This way I can more easily compare and check that the speeds are the same and that it feels right and similar. So I always work on the forward axis, and then maybe at the very end when I'm done, I rotate my left cycle so the character goes to the left of the scene, I rotate my right cycle so the character goes to the right, and backward so it goes backward. But while I work on the same axis. It's much easier. So I can bake that to the scene. So far, I've only worried about the character itself, and I've completely ignored my root controller. So in this tutorial, we assume that you have a root controller, so an object that the root bone is constrained to. So this first bone of the hierarchy here is constrained to my root controller, and that root controller is part of the character extensions of your character, right? There's going to be a tutorial to set up that root controller. So maybe because I moved everything in story mode, it's kind of doing some weird stuff and like translating. If you want to quickly clean it up for every take all at once, you have two solutions. You can go into F-curve, select translation, rotation, select all your curves, and apply a 0 value. Then copy paste that, maybe lock this, lock the view here, jump to another take, and paste that. So every time I paste, and it's reset to 0. Just to start fresh, you know. If you have a lot of takes and you don't want to copy paste every time, you can also create a relation constraint, add the root control to that constraint as a receiver, and then override rotation, so set a value on rotation and set a value on translation. This way, like the relation constraint overrides what you have on your scene, and you can just bake that on every take all at once. So you have two techniques, and then you can delete the relation constraint. And you can see on my root control, I have a lot of custom properties, and in my I have this master relation constraint that allows me to like drive those settings when I animate. So in my case, I have what I call a temp root bake. So this property just activates a constraint, which is here, which is just my root control. It's a position constraint of my root control following the last control of the spine and the hips. So it's kind of like the center of mass. Okay, and since we only work on the forward axis, in my constraint I'm gonna ignore the x-axis and the y. So I only work on z. Okay, so my root bone roughly follows the pelvis. And here I have two solutions. I can bake it. So if I bake my root, I'll see this forward curve here on Z. But the thing is, you know, it goes forward, and then in my case, like there's a little bit of overshoot. So the root goes a bit too much forward and then comes back into idle as the character like settles. So the hips have a little bit of like weight shifting and they go back and forth. And I don't necessarily want that because in my case I want like the curve of the root to be a bit more simple, and when the character like comes into a stop, I want it to stop and then rest here and not like overshoot and go back and forth. So what I'm going to do is, instead of baking like this, I'm just going to key where I'm interested. So I'm gonna key on the first frame, then I'm gonna key somewhere here, and it has the character decelerates and comes into the final pose. Maybe I'm gonna key on the last frame. Okay, so I'll leave it for now. I'll come to the start. For the start, I'm gonna do the same. I'm gonna key on the first frame. Then as he accelerates, I'm gonna key here, maybe key here, and then I'm gonna key on the last frame. So I have a much more simple version of that forward motion. Okay. And on the cycle, so I'm going to delete all those curves, all those keys. I'm just going to key on the first and on the last key. Okay. Now I can remove my constraint. So if you made a custom constraint, you can deactivate it here. Otherwise, in my case, I'm just going to deactivate the option in my master relation, which means that now I can, edit the root again manually. So on the cycle, why did I key just the first and the last frame? It's because I want a constant speed. So when I look here, I can see that my root goes linearly, so I have a constant speed across the entire animation. It's not like if I had baked like this, because the hips, when you run, they don't have a linear speed. They accelerate and decelerate and accelerate and decelerate because you fall on every step you fall, so you have a slight acceleration deceleration. So you can see that my curve here isn't really straight. It actually oscillates like this. So I don't want that. So that's why I only keyed on the first and last key. So in my scene, I have a second camera that follows the root. And when I look at it, I can see that, my character has a little bit of back and forth, and the hips still move compared to the root. Like, they slow down and they reaccelerate, and that makes a cycle that feels really alive. Because if you have the hips following the root bone like one-on-one, when you will play that in game on the player character, it will feel very locked. Like the pelvis will be locked on screen, and that would feel odd. Same on the side. If I look back, the character has some slight like left and right motion. Okay, and if I come to the start, I have now a clean ramp up. So I don't have like a root that, first goes back, for example, and then forward. I don't want that. I want a root that really progresses forward like smoothly. So maybe I'm actually going to take those first few keys and make them to auto, so I really have a clean tangent. So on the first part, I keyed a little bit more because there's a ramp up, but the second half I only keyed once or twice to have something that's a little bit more broad. And the thing is, because my root is constrained to a bit of the pelvis and a bit of the spine, my root now doesn't exactly start at 0. It starts at, in my case, minus 0.7. So I want to select all those keys and just make sure they start at 0. So I'm going to offset them all by selecting the lowest value and setting it to 0. And that offset all my keys up. So now it starts perfectly at 0. Same on the stop. I'm going to select those keys, set them to maybe just the last two keys. Because if I select the first key as well, and I set them to auto, my first key is flat. And this is not good because in my case, coming from the stop, I start at full speed. So I just want to select the last keys and set them to auto, but not the first one. And in this case, I keyed on the last frame because this is where my character ends up in idle. But I don't want, you know, I don't want the root to like translate during the entire stop. I want it to settle and come still much sooner in the animation. So maybe when the character like reaches roughly its final position, I'm gonna move that last key and make it come early. Maybe that's a little bit too early, like somewhere here. Again, I'm gonna select those keys and make them start at 0. And I'm gonna tweak to make sure that you know, the root like slows down a bit more abruptly. So maybe I'm gonna take the last key and expand the tangent slightly. You know, the goal of the root when you work on the Locomotion set is to mimic what the capsule is going to do in game. So in my case, using Unreal, when you let go of the joystick, the capsule comes into a stop very quickly. You know, there's not a lot of sliding and moving forward. So that's why I want the root to like comes into a stop like pretty soon in the animation and then not move anymore. Even if the hips like settle and still drift a bit, like my root, like after 15 frames, it's already still. Okay. So I have a root that feels very smooth and progressive. And now that we have a nice root animation, we can do two things. We can tweak the speed of the cycle, and we can start applying poses, because we always apply poses relative to the root bone. So for my cycle, my jog forward, again, I want to select those two keys and make them start at 0 to ignore that first little delta. Okay. I check that my speed, my loop is still perfect. Okay, there's no hiccup. So I remove the texture to be able to see what's going on. Okay, it feels like a perfect loop, so I can re-enable my textures to see the checker floor. And because my speed is linear and starts exactly at 0, I can know the speed of my cycle. So what I mean by the speed is how much in meters per second like my root moves, because that's what the capsule in the game engine is going to do, right? The capsule is going to move at a certain speed that's set by a designer or by an animator or a programmer, and you want to make sure your animation matches that speed to avoid foot sliding. So if I come at frame 30, because I work at 30 FPS, frame 30 is my position after 1 second. I select my root, and here on Z I can see a certain number. In my case it's right now 419 dot something, blah blah blah. So this is my speed in centimeters per second. In this case, in MotionBuilder, it's in centimeters. So 419 units. So hopefully your game engine is set up with the same units, of course. In Unreal, it's the case. It's in centimeters. And maybe you need to match a specific speed. So here it's kind of random. It's what comes from the mocap. And let's say I want to match like 450, because maybe that's the speed that designers want my character to move at. Usually for a jog, it's about 400, so 4 meters per second. A sprint, it's more around 7 meters per second, and a walk is between 1 and 2 meters per second. In general, those are rough values. In our case, we want the character to run a bit faster, so we want to reach 450. So the best is to select your root and lock the properties. This way, I'll always see what's going on in the translation. And the first thing you can do to speed it up is, of course, speeding up the timing. So insert it in story mode, and then you can, here in scale mode, you can speed up your cycle a bit. So what I do is I come into my follow camera, look at it from the back, and I'm going to speed it up slightly so it feels right. Because you can see that it's I mean, this is the realistic timing coming from the mocap, but in-game you can always speed things up a little. So maybe I'm going to speed it up. So again, I'm going to stay on my frame 30 and I'm going to scale it. So I see the impact that it has here on the speed. So if I scale maybe 6%, so it's 6% faster, I'm already getting close, quite close to my 450 that I'm looking for, right? And maybe I can scale it up even more. But at some point, maybe it's going to feel like it's going a little too fast. So of course, every time you scale, you need to right-click and say frame start and end, so your timeline matches your clip, and you still see the loop nicely. So maybe this is a little too fast. Like I want to, change the timing, but not too much. So maybe I'm going to stay around here for 4% or 6%. And that feels kind of okay. So I'm looking at the overall feel of the cycle, but I'm also looking at the cadency. Like, does it feel right? Like in terms of tempo. Like if you look at the steps, boom, 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 boom. You want to make sure that if you have a sprint on top of that the sprint has a higher cadency. So maybe the sprint is going to be like 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2 2. Maybe the walk is more like 2 2 2 2. That's what I pay attention to as well. So here the jog, it feels kind of okay for something a bit casual but not too much. And the total number of frames doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is here's the speed at frame 30. That's the most important. So that feels right, and we're pretty close to our 450. So I can bake that. And now to reach the final, to reach exactly 450, what I'm going to do is use a layer, key at frame 0, store that pose, come at the last frame. So at frame 46, I want to move the root so that at frame 30, it matches exactly 450. So I have two ways of doing that. I can come at frame 30, apply, and say, okay, I want this to be 450. So there's a slight offset. Okay. And I can key that. And now when I come to my F-curve, I can see that there's a little delta here that was applied. Okay, so 3 centimeters. So it's going to be a few centimeters just to, fix the difference between here my 446 and match exactly 450. But the thing is, here my clip is not exactly 1 second long. It's actually 46 frames long. So it's a second and a half. So what I can do is come here in the curves and say pre-post extrapolation. And after constant, I can select keep slope, say infinite. So actually my root is offset around frame 46 as well. So now I know the exact number that I need to put at frame 46 for frame 30 to match exactly 450. Okay, so I know that here on my cycle, if I have 690 here, and even if I delete that key at 30 now, I still have 450 because it's the same curve that was applied on the layer. And I just want to make sure that I apply my pose, because right now if I look at the first and last pose, there's a little hiccup. So that's why I stored the pose. Now I can apply it and make sure it matches. So for me, rather than applying the value at frame 30 and then changing the slope type of the curve and then reapplying the pose here, I prefer to do a bit of math. So I take my calculator and I say, okay, at frame 46, I want it to be 450 divided by 30. And I have the exact same number. So the math are multiply the distance that you want by the number of frames that you have in your animation, so the total number of frames, and divide it by 30. So I want to know the distance for 46 frames that would match my target distance for 30 frames. Okay? So this is very easy to remember. And the advantage is that if you have a very short animation, because for example for a sprint, maybe your cycle is less than 1 second, you can still do those math. You could say, okay, maybe for 24 frames, I want a cycle that matches 750 centimeters per second. So per second, it's 600. So I know that my sprint on frame 24 would be 600, you know. So in my case, it's 690. So I can enter that number, and I can apply the pose. And if I come back to frame 30, I have exactly 450. So it's the same thing, but just with the calculator, it's a little bit faster. And of course, now that I apply this layer on the first and last frame, there is a little bit of sliding on the feet. You might not see it exactly here, but there is, like, the feet do drift a little compared to the original mocap where it doesn't drift. So to fix that, I don't want to bake right now, because I introduce with that layer, that speed tuning, I introduce a bit of sliding. I select both legs and I look at the different passing poses. So I have a passing pose here, I have a passing pose here, and I key every time. Yeah, maybe here. Okay, I look at when a knee passes over the other knee. And actually, I usually just apply the adjustment blend script. So maybe I duplicate my layer, hide the original one, and apply the adjustment blend on my duplicate. And usually that's good enough. I just want to make sure, once again, I didn't introduce leg overextension, so I can use some IK pulling. Because sometimes when you really like make the speed in centimeters per second a lot higher, you start adding a lot of overextension, because your feet try to, you know, have a longer foot straight. So sometimes you want to make sure you maybe lower the pelvis a little, even if you revisit that later. You can always lower the pelvis and make sure you don't overextend the legs. So here it's rather easy, because the difference between my original mocap and my target speed isn't big. Like I only had like 4 centimeters difference to match. So the adjustment blending was enough to fix the foot sliding. But just for the example, let's say that I need to reach a much higher speed. So maybe, I don't know, 550. So again, I'm going to store my pose, make sure my pose is up to date. And at frame 46, I need to match 550 units for 30 frames. So I have this value of 843. Okay, so now at frame 30 I match 550, and we can see that the feet do slide a little bit. So we're going to need to do some manual adjustment here, because if I just use the adjustment blend, there's going to be some overextension, and it's going to be pretty hard to fix. Even if I use the IK pulling, it's a bit too extreme. So let's look at a manual approach. So on the layer where I've applied the speed adjustment, right, So let me call that like 550 speed matching. I'm going to select both legs, and in body part I'm going to key every time I have a passing pose. Passing pose. Passing pose. Passing pose. And then I have the last one. The last pose is around the beginning and end frame. So my goal is to make sure that that key, that delta, is the same when the foot lands and when the foot lifts up. And as I do that, I want to clean up the leg overextension. So first I'm going to do this. I'm going to take every foot, and every time they land, I'm going to copy the key, copy paste the key. So my foot, here my left foot is locked during that entire phase here, the entire moment. Then when the right foot lands, I do the same here, and it lifts. So my right foot is planted here. So basically I make sure that I conserve the groundness of the feet from the base layer, right? If I look at the base layer, foot is grounded here, and even on my speed matching layer, it's grounded as well, and there's no sliding. And on the left foot, so the last one is a little trickier because the planting is shared across the end and beginning of the animation. And then there are some tricks to reduce that overextension. To begin with, if we want to work like without the IK pulling, because the problem with IK pulling is when you use it, it's hard to then edit the hips because they're kind of like driven by the legs, and they are influenced by the legs. So let's try and work without it. It's more for like final adjustment rather than doing like manual edits of the pose. So what I can do is lower the hips manually. So of course here it's a little too much, it's too crouched, but at least I don't introduce overextension. I'm going to reduce that, and I'm going to try and find when the legs are the most extended. So maybe here on that push, the left leg is almost extended. Sometimes it's just a matter of shifting a foot more forward or more backward compared to the hips just on another layer with just one key to say that maybe my foot is this way instead of having the leg stretch during the push. I actually relax the push a bit. I just have the planting be a bit more ahead, because usually you have some bandwidth on the landing part, and it's on the push that the leg is more stretched. So on those two layers, I've done some broad adjustment, like lowering the hips and then maybe offsetting a foot slightly more ahead or back. Then I want to come back to my speed matching layer, and I can start doing some fine tuning, and maybe especially like after the foot has just lifted, I want it to come back up a bit quicker, and before it lands I want to bring it back a little and have it come back and land at the very last moment. So instead of having a long moment where it's like stretched outward in front of the character, I want it to come back a little, come in a little late. And maybe I want to emphasize also the that just having some stretch just before the planting. And of course during the plant I also want to make sure that the foot is grounded nicely, so using the modifier feet floor contact option. even because I keyed here at the beginning on the passing pose, I know that when my foot is lifted, it's going to look nice, and it matches the pose from the base layer. Now, if for some reason you got rid of that key where the foot was lifted, and you add a 0 key, you will have this kind of artifact here where it's being pulled all the way back. And that's because with this 0 key that I just applied, it's trying to match the original position that it had on the base layer. So suddenly your foot is trying to get all the way here because this is like the position that it had before I made the character move faster and match 550 units. And if you want to have this exact pose relative to the hips without the stretching here, you apply the 0 key and then you temporarily disable the IK blend translation. This way the foot is brought back under the pelvis, so it's the 0 key, but it's in FK now, so it's relative to the hips. You can key that, okay, apply that key, and now you're able to re-inject the IK blend translation. The same trick is useful if you work on the pose that's around here at the end. So if here at the end I lower and I plant my foot, okay, and I key that, I can copy paste that key here just before as the foot comes into contact. But if I come all the way at the beginning, because this is my last frame, so if I come all the way at the beginning and I copy paste that last key, my foot is going to be pulled forward because that key is not a 0 key. That key here has the forward displacement that I have applied at the very beginning. So I want to apply that key, but then remove the IK translation key and then re-inject it. Or I can also use the pose control and copy that last pose, come at the beginning, and apply the pose in full body, and key that left leg. And once I've keyed that, I can actually copy my key over when the foot lifts. So it's always a matter of applying the same layered key when the foot is planted. Another example here, I want my foot to be planted, I key and I copy paste that, and I paste it here. And then I work out the transition out and the transition in to remove any kind of stretching or awkwardness or anything like that. So usually I end up with more keys in the area when the foot comes into planting and comes out. And then when the foot is up, I have less key. I just have like the initial key that I had that conserves my passing pose. So I have more keys here. And once you worked out the feet pretty nicely, you can always reduce your hips layer and almost reach that overextension, but not quite, because usually it's very subtle and characters almost push to the limit of their leg, and there's almost an overextension, but not quite. So maybe try to find a moment when it's overextending and play around with the weight. You could even animate the weight of that layer to have different values throughout the cycle. So now my character runs at a much faster speed, but there's still no foot sliding. So of course you have to work on forward displacement like this if you want to match an exact speed and remove foot sliding. Like you can't work with the old-fashioned way of working on a on-spot cycle. Usually game engines nowadays don't work like that anymore. But of course, if you do want to work on the spot, you can always add a layer. On spot, key the first frame, store that pose, go on the last frame, make the root be at 0, apply the pose in full body, key, and now you have the character running on the spot. Because since this is a constant and linear keys, that's fine, you don't have any drifting. Of course you don't want those keys to be flat, otherwise they wouldn't match the energy from the base layer, right? The base layer is constant and linear, so if you have flat keys here, it's not going to work. There's going to be a back and forth like this. So you want that to be linear. So you could, for example, check how it feels when it loops, things like that, and then you can always turn it off and then export that animation. So now I basically have the proper timing for my cycle, and I have the proper speed in meters per second on the root bone. Maybe I just want to do a quick timing pass on the start and stop as well. So on the start, I'm going to add it to the story, and I know that on my cycle I scaled things up by 6 or 8%, so I can do the same on the start. Maybe on the start I want to be a bit more aggressive because I really want the start to feel responsive, so I'm going to speed it up maybe 10, 12% tops, something like that. Make sure that when I look at it from the follow camera, it still feels right. I actually have a very long wait at the beginning. This part here where he starts leaning forward is very long. So maybe I'm gonna speed that first bit up even more. And there's a trick that I could do. So I could potentially cut the animation and make the start when he's starting to move and lift his foot, for the start to be even more responsive. So let's say I'm gonna move my start back, and at frame 0 I have that first part where he moves his foot. But the thing is, I still want to keep that original frame here where he's more upright, because this is closer to my idle pose, right? If I look at the pose on frame 0, he's already leaning, so there's a delta, and on frame -6, so I'm working in the negative, he's more upright. And my goal, the technique I'm going to use later on, is applying the idle pose not on frame 0 where he's already leaning, but on frame -6 where he's more upright. And because I work in minus, I know later on in my game engine that I'm going to cut those first 6 frames. So those first 6 frames are just for me to edit the animation a bit more easily. So I'm going to have a start that feels a lot more responsive. And I could make that even faster, I think. So I choose -6. So I choose -6 because -6 is a multiply of 3. In this case, it's it's a multiply of 3. So 3, 6, 9. Any number that when you add the numbers, it's still a multiply of 3. So 12, for example, is a multiply of 3 because 2 plus 1 equals 3. Because that's easier to convert into seconds once in the game engine. Because 3 frames is 0.1 second, 6 frame is 0.2 seconds. Every time you have just a 0 point and one number after the dot, so it's easier. So either choose -3 or -6 or -9, but don't choose -2 or -4 or -5, because that's harder to convert. So in the game engine, I know that I can start my animation at 0.2 seconds. The thing is, during those first 6 frames, my root already starts moving, and that's not good. I want the root to stay still until the start actually kicks in. So if I am to remove those first 6 frames, I want the root to remain still during those first 6 frames. So I can maybe delete that, and yeah, I can delete it, and then maybe on a layer I can say you start at 0 flat and you are a 0 key on the layer. This linear. So now my root is still during the first 6 frames, and then as he starts moving, I have the ramp up. Yeah, so now when I look at it from here, it feels pretty responsive. Boom. Boom. Okay? Responsive and sharp. So I have the first part going a little faster, and then I cut, and the last part I start to slow it down more and more. And more. So I have like a slowdown at the end. And then maybe I'm gonna make that animation end around frame 45. Once you have the definite timing of your animations, it's a good place to apply a layer. It's a good moment to apply a filter. So on every markers, every controllers of your rig, just apply a Butterworth with the default value, just to make sure you get rid of the basic jitter coming from the mocap. And it's better to do that once you've scaled and tuned the timing of your animation, because you then apply this on a 30 FPS rate, and that's better than doing it directly on the raw mocap before doing the timing pass in story mode. So we have a correct timing on our start, our loop, and our stop. We have a root bone that's properly animated, and we thought things ahead a bit with the start by having an initial pose that's more upright, like our idle, and we know we're going to cut the start a little, like the first 6 frames, to have something that feels a bit more responsive. So we kind of ignore that first part where the character starts leaning forward and start shifting his weight. In game, we're going to ignore that whole part and start the animation directly here and let blending do its work to have something that feels a bit sharper and a bit more responsive. But we kept those first 6 frames in the negative to apply the idle pose here. So I'm going to do that now, actually, because now that my root is well animated and proper, I can apply my idle pose. So maybe you already have that idle pose stored in your library. Here I have my player idle. So I'm going to create a layer and apply that idle on frame -6. As you can see, in my idle, the player is upright, and that means that if I scrub down to frame 0, I conserve that little shifting, that weight shifting forward, which is a good thing, right? Because when I play the animation in the engine, I'm going to start directly from that pose, and it's going to feel, again, a bit more responsive. Then when I scrub, of course, the legs start doing some odd stuff. They shift to the side, and they look a bit awkward. That's because, of course, the delta that I have here on my idle pose between the idle pose and the base layer, there's a big difference, right? My legs were a little bit to the side here, and so this is applied throughout my entire animation. So maybe somewhere here at the end, what I'm going to do is select the lower body, so the hips and both legs, and being in body part, I'm going to add a 0 key. So I'm going to, retrieve what I had in the base layer for the lower body at least. And on the up body, for now, I'm going to keep that. So I basically have an animation that starts from idle and, starts going into the cycle and keeping legs kind of straight. And I still have an attitude on the up body that's, is close to my attitude in the idle, right? If I look at the original layer, it was a lot different. Like the fingers were not bent, the shoulders are different, the torso is twisted differently, and the head is looking down, because that's what I have in the original mocap, right? And here with that layer, I already start having something that feels a bit more consistent with the idle. And I'm going to take that last key here, and I'm going to copy that and work on the cycle. So basically, I start working on the start, I apply the idle, then I take that key and I copy it on my cycle. So you can copy the key, or you can also copy the entire layer, come into your cycle, paste the layer, and of course on the layer you want to make sure you only keep that last key and not the first one that I had here on frame -6. So you can use both techniques. And on that first frame, if I disable the layer, I can see that my up body is affected, but my legs and my pelvis aren't, because it's a 0 key. So on the lower body, I have exactly what I have on my original layer. And usually I find that easier to start editing the animation from there, because usually in the mocap during the cycle, the legs and the hips are, you don't want to change that too much. I mean, you want to fix it, but I find easier to fix the legs and pelvis by just editing what's on the base layer, rather than applying an existing pose. It's okay for the up body, but for the lower body, it's a bit too difficult. So I prefer to work that way. And what I'm going to do is identify, again, the passing poses. So here I have left foot planted, and a bit later I have right foot planted. Maybe I'm going to key at those moments, those different parts. And I'm going to adjust the feet when they are planted like that. So maybe, usually in this case my feet are a bit like too much to the side, like a duck. They're a bit too outwards. I'm going to rotate it slightly, maybe move it to the side, maybe open up the knees a little. So now that I key on that left leg, I want to copy that key at the very end. And same for the right leg. I want to offset that, maybe unduck it. Okay, and I could copy that on that other passing pose if I want. I'm going to make sure that the feet feel planted as well, because sometimes in the mocap it's not exactly touching the floor, especially here because I have a naked character. I don't have like the thickness of the shoe, so it's a bit floating. And usually when I work on locomotion like that, I don't bother. I select my character, I go into the options of the character settings. So you have it here in the navigator, you also have it here in the properties. I go into floor contact and I activate the feet floor contact, as well as feet floor contact automatic toe base. So if those are set up correctly, you can push your foot all the way down and it's gonna contact against the floor. So I make sure that my feet have a nice contact like this. So I'm on the left foot, all the way down, and all the way down. I'm going to copy paste that first key on the last frame. And again, I want to make sure I don't overextend the legs, so I'm going to use a little bit of eye key pulling here, and maybe select your calf, and if you want you can remove all the keys that you have on the calf. So again, that respects exactly the calf angle that you have on the base layer. So here I have my key where the foot is planted, and maybe I want to copy that key when the foot contact happens, and same when it lifts, to have like the same delta during the entire plant. And maybe I'm going to start editing like how it looks when the foot pushes, and avoid like weird orientation. So maybe I want to slightly do that. And same for the passing pose at the beginning and the end. I have my foot planted, left foot, so I'm going to copy this key here, and the last key, I'm going to copy it here. So I want to edit the pose maybe differently from when it's planted and when it's up. I don't necessarily want the same delta. Sometimes it looks nice, sometimes it's like too much to the side, for example here, so I want to bring it back. Here, for example, it's a bit too much like that. I usually start to edit with as least keys as possible, and this way I avoid introducing some weird motion that wasn't there in the mocap, you know. Just want to clean things up at that point and not push it too much, or not take the risk of breaking something and making it worse than it was. That's why I start broad. So I first start focusing on the passing poses, then I copy those contact keys, and then I clean it up a little bit more. But I always start to work broad and look at the entire animation all at once, and not focus on one particular part for too long. You know. And you know, here I could start also editing the up body, maybe adding a little bit more like shoulder movement, maybe addressing the overall stance. So maybe here's a bit too much to the side, so I'm gonna adjust that a little. Maybe my neck is also a bit awkward. Zero it out, make it a little bit more natural. Gonna make sure that from the front view my character looks forward. Maybe I want to give him a certain like attitude, maybe a bit more confident, maybe a bit more upright. So usually on the first pass I focus more on the overall pose. I don't immediately start messing with like the motion of the arms or everything like throughout the entire animation. I look more just like I try to nail the overall pose with one key, or maybe another key somewhere in the middle of the take. And I make sure I don't break stuff. So I make sure I don't introduce a leg overextension. I make sure I don't break the loop by adding maybe adding a key here in the middle, but not copying the first key on the last frame. That would break the loop, obviously. So here I would do that. Just go step by step. Take your time. Make sure you don't break stuff. But so that first part is about cleaning the overall posture. Okay. Here I noticed that my character has some like a little bit of jitter, like left and right on the torso and on the hips. So if I want to clean that up, I can duplicate the base layer and come into the curves. So for example, on the hips, left and right curves. And I could clean up the jitter here with some filters, or manually deleting keys or things like that. Just the usual cleanup. Okay, so here I'm going to put a bit of Butterworth. So on the pelvis it's a bit better, but on the spine it still jitters. If you start putting some IK translation on the chest, you'll see that the chest may move a little forward. So maybe you want to, key that again and see if it still happens. If it still happens, then you want to bake and then add the translation. So before baking, that might be a good moment to duplicate your take and keep a safe version, and then bake here. Now that I bake, I can duplicate my base layer, turn on IK translation on the chest, and clean up my translation. Even more. Yeah, and I could do that on the head as well. Maybe even offset it. So on X and Y, it's easy to look at the curves because they are, looping properly, right? But if you look at the Z-axis, it's a lot harder because there's an actual displacement forward throughout the scene, right? So if I have the hips here, for example, when I'm in my follow camera, sometimes the hip jitter here is not too bad, but sometimes they jitter a bit too much, like they go back and forth a bit too quickly, and it's hard to edit because of that displacement here. So what you can do is create an auxiliary effector for the pelvis, and then parent that auxiliary effector to your root control. So in my case, I already have that, and I already have that, and I already have those hips auxiliary effector as part of my character extensions. This way, when I bake, when I work in full body, it's part of the character. And with those hips auxiliary effector, I can see the motion of my hips relative to the root, because again they are parented to my root control. And in my case, I again have made it an option in the master relation constraint, which is called temp hips roots space. So what this option does is it turns off a constraint. So I have my hips root bake, and that's my auxiliary effector following my hips effector. So by default it's on. Right, so if I don't have the option turn on, I have my hips effector always following the hips effector. So if when I normally animate, and I animate with my hips effector, the auxiliary effector in pink follows all the time. So it doesn't do anything. But then when I turn my option on, hip root space, my parent constraint is set to 0 weight. So now, if I try to move my my hips around, the effector tries to take the upper hand, so I can turn off the IK blend on my hips, and now my auxiliary effector drives everything. So I see the exact same animation, but now I can work on those curves that are relative to the roots, so they actually loop now, even on the forward axis, to be able to clean that up. So I could just make sure it loops perfectly by going to pre-post extrapolation, make sure that that last tangent feels right, or I could apply just a little bit of Butterworth and make it a little smoother, or I could increase or decrease that entire range of motion, make it a lot steadier, a lot more constant, or on the contrary, make it push it and exaggerate it. so you have a little bit more back and forth. And then once I'm done, I can always, bake everything in full body again and turn off my option. So this is set up with custom properties and relation constraint. Sometimes on your cycle, the shoulders or the head are a little too stiff, and you can add a little like cartoony effect and add some more overlap very quickly using the IK blend. So if I duplicate my take, and I'm going to take my hands, my shoulders, my head, I'm going to go to the curves, and I'm going to set everything to pre-post extrapolation, infinite repetition on both pre and post extrapolation. So I can now see my curves and the curves before and after. Okay, so the loop is continuous, and if I offset my keys, there's still, data before and after my curves. So now I can, for example, take my head and take the Y translation, so the up and down, and I can offset it slightly. So nothing happens until I actually turn on some IK translation, because I'm interacting with the translation. And now you can see that because I delayed the head, there's some like wobble appearing. So it makes things a little bit more cartoony, and of course if the effect is too strong, I can either reduce the IK blend translation and make it rather subtle, or I can turn off the intensity of my layer entirely. So I usually add just a little bit of that on the shoulder and head, especially if the mocap data is a little too stiff. And if you do it on the shoulders, you can always re-add some IK translation on the hands, so the hands don't wobble too much. So here it's like pretty strong, but maybe I want it stronger on the clavicles and not as strong on the head. Okay. And to animate the fingers, I like to have some motion on the fingers as well, usually. And same, I don't necessarily like animate those by hand. On a layer, I may apply a pose where they are more open. So usually I have a pose library for that, but here I'm going to do it very quickly, very broad. Okay, I'm going to do another layer for the left fingers. And what I'm going to do is just animate the weight of those layers. And I'm not even going to do it by hand. I mean, I could, but I'm just going to do it by copying some data. So I'm going to go ahead and select the right hand, for example. So let's focus on the right fingers for now. I'm going to select the right hand and come into the base layer and look at the Y curve. So basically I'm going to use that data of the hands going up and down to animate my fingers. So I'm going to copy the Y translation here, and I'm going to paste that on my layer here, which are again the right fingers, and these are my left fingers. And I'm going to select the layer, so right fingers, the weight, I'm going to add at least one key on the weight so it's animatable. And I'm going to paste my data here. Of course, because those were like translation data, the numbers are, going from a certain range. So here it's from 95 to 122. I'm going to make it like go from 0 to 100. So it represents, the percentage of my layer with like the maximum range. And I'm going to do pre-post extrapolation once again. This is really useful. and maybe I'm gonna offset that a little in time, so there's a little delay. And you can see already that the fingers are doing kind of opening and closing slightly based on the up and down motion of the fingers. And if that's not strong enough, you can always duplicate your layer so you have a stronger effect. Maybe on that duplicate, or you could make the pose stronger, the pose that you applied on your layer, and maybe you can tone down that effect. And see here I already have some kind of bounce, and let's assume that's good enough for what we want here. I'm just gonna do the same on the left finger. So you can use the up and down of your hand. You can use maybe the left and right. You can use whatever you want. Let's do it with left and right here, just for variety sake. So I'm going to select my X translation. I'm going to go on my layer where I applied my pose on the left fingers. Select my layer here, the weight. Apply at least one key. So I can do it here. I can do it here. Then I want to paste my keys. I'm going to do some pre-post extrapolation, offset it in time slightly, put it 0 and 100. Sometimes you actually want to play around and inverse those curves if the effect is not the one you want. Let's say here I want to inverse. Depends when you want it to open, when you want it to close. You could even go over 100 if you want. So I have a small effect on the fingers, and that's good enough for what I want. Usually you don't want to spend too much time animating fingers on cycles, as long as they are not stiff and not keeping the same animation throughout the entire clip, it's usually good enough. So let's say I'm happy with this cycle now. It loops perfectly, it matches exactly the speed that I want in terms of root displacement. It has linear and constant speed. The fingers are a little bit animated. The overall posture is consistent with my idle pose. The legs are properly animated. There's not too much jitter going left and right or back and forth. And I'm happy with the overall style, basically. I'm going to store poses. I'm going to store the passing poses. So if I look on the side view, when the knee crosses the other knee, I'm going to store that pose. So maybe that's jog forward left foot, and maybe I want the right foot pose. Right foot. And on the start, remember we had the idle pose applied on the first frame, and when there's a passing pose, I'm going to apply one of the poses from my cycle. So here's the right foot planted, and at the end I have a left foot planted. And of course, during the interpolation between my keys, there's some weird stuff happening, like the feet slide a bit, so I need to adjust that. What I can do is maybe during that first part where he's coming into a lean, I could duplicate my first key, the key where I applied the idle, to have something that feels a little bit better. And I could adjust everything manually, copy the keys of the feet when they are planted on the floor. So if, for example, my right foot is planted here. I'm going to copy my initial key once again. So I can do all this manually, or I can use the adjustment blend script. So again, I duplicate the layer on which I have my main keys. I turn it off and I applied the script. The thing is, maybe here, because I applied the passing pose, he comes upright very early in the start animation. So what I do is, when I apply the script, I do some back and forth, and I look at what works and what doesn't with the script, and then I delete the layer and readapt my original one. So let's go like edit original. So maybe I'm gonna delete some keys here on the up body to have a little bit more of that energy from the base layer, a bit more leaning. Apply, adjust it. Okay, so I still don't have enough leaning, so I'm going to do that again, and maybe if I want to force a certain pose at a certain time, I just need a key. And if I key, the script will know that I really want that pose here. So I could, like, work out one of the in-betweens to have something a bit stronger. Okay, and now I do have this pose. Okay, and I could, on top of that, keep editing and maybe cleaning another in between. And if I'm happy with that on the start, the last thing that I do is re-injecting some of the cycle into the start. Because I applied the poses at the end, but doesn't mean that the tangents and the overall speed is exactly the same, right? Maybe the speed here of the root is not exactly the same. So I go to my cycle. In story mode, I insert it. I drag it a little bit to the side. Then I come back to start. I insert the start. And just like we did when we made the cycle loop with itself, I'm going to insert some of the cycle at the end of my start. So I'm going to look at how the start ends. So it ends with like left foot planting. So I want to find an equivalent in the cycle. Actually, my cycle starts on the left foot passing. So yeah, I can probably select something in the middle, or maybe the end. So I'm going to crop some of that. So here I have a contact. I have a contact here. It's really the same technique. You want to come into front view and you check that the contacts are good. Yeah, let's refer to the right foot contact instead. This time up. frame. Check that the timing feels right. Make sure it's a smooth interpolation. Maybe tune the blending, so maybe you can make the blending a little shorter so that during the first part of the start you keep some of the lean and just match the last like 15 frames or so. And once you're done from the front view, you want to come to the side view and make sure you match the translation on the forward axis as well. And now we're sure that by the time the start animation ends, the root translation matches exactly the one of the cycle, and the cycle really feels the same. So you don't have any difference between how the start and the cycle feel. They feel very consistent now. And if I want, because I have the cycle, I have more leeway and I can make the start animation last a little longer if that's required by my engine. So maybe I want it to be 45 frames long, for instance. Or maybe I want to make sure I have like at least a few steps in the start. So here there's a first passing pose, and there's one passing pose and a second one. So I'm going to stop somewhere here, maybe at frame 42. And now we just have to work on the stop. Same thing on the stop, we want to apply the idle pose, so usually you apply it at the end. And here, remember, we cut the stop around a passing pose, so it's easy for me to apply the corresponding passing pose, so right foot here. And now I just have like the stop. Of course it's drifting during the entire animation because I just have a key at the beginning and at the end. Just like the stop, I could edit that manually and copy the last key, the key where I applied the idle, to have something that matches. But because I'm lazy, I'm just going to use the adjustment blend. So this is pose original, and then if I duplicate that, it's going to be pose with adjustment blend. The adjustment blend does that work for me and just keeps the energy of the original layer and makes sure like my character is in the idle pose when he needs to be in. It removes all the foot drifting and things like that. And of course I can tune that on top, so if I have a weird foot here, I could tune that a little up. And if I want, I can also make the stop distance a lot shorter. So again, if I key on my first frame, so the animation still starts at 0, but on the last one, maybe I want to set a specific distance, so maybe 75 centimeters instead of 118 in my case. So maybe you have a specific distance that you need to match. Or maybe you want all your stops to be the exact same distance. I can reapply the pose and again apply the adjustment blend. So now I have a fairly short stop. And at that point I'm pretty much done with the whole locomotion set.